Good evening.
When you think of Hollywood, there are names that are synonymous with the evolution of Hollywood to what it is today. And when you think of horror films, you think of a Mount Rushmore, and there is one name that will always be on that mountain. Vincent Price is a name that echoes through the annals of Hollywood history, and not just Hollywood, art, international chef, advocate for Native American rights and LGBTQ plus rights. And that has also gone down to his daughter, who we have the pleasure of speaking with today. She has the Hide and Seat podcast. She is a noted author, and she's a motivational speaker. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Victoria Price. Thank you for having time to spend with us today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me and Allie on the show here.
Oh, Allie can come on our show as well as you anytime. We are actively looking for a mascot for this film.
Well, she might well volunteer.
Excellent. As a dog lover myself, this made my day. Your father, I don't even know where to begin, but I'm going to try. I believe as a child, his first love wasn't acting, if I'm correct. He was an avid art lover. And I don't think most people are aware of this unless they've read the wonderful books that your father and yourself have penned. Could you tell us a little bit about your father's childhood and how it led to the success that he had?
Absolutely. He was the youngest child of a very successful man, the man who ran the largest candy company in the United States and was head of the National Candy Makers Association. And second Vincent Price, my dad was the third Vincent Price. My dad's dad was the youngest child, very creative kid, went to high school with Orson Welles' father. They did magic shows and all these cool things. But when the stock market crashed in 1893, he was pulled out of Yale and put in charge of one of the family businesses, this candy company. And it became very successful. He had 4 kids, and his eldest son, he wanted to follow in the family business. But his youngest son, who was his youngest child, came along way, way later and was clearly this creative child. And so I think he was his namesake. He was, Vincent Jr. And I think he saw in my dad the creative guy that he hadn't been allowed to become. So he absolutely fostered my dad's creativity. And so my dad showed an early interest in acting. He played Robin Hood in Robin Hood when he was, 8 years old, and also in art. He fell in love with the visual arts, loved visiting galleries, of which there weren't that many in St. Louis, Missouri in the 1920s. And when they built their new house, they built him an artist's garret to live in. They helped him put the money together to go on a trip to Europe to see the great works of art when he was 17. And when he went to Yale, which is also where his dad had gone, he studied art history and then went on to London and studied art history and actually would have become an art historian, but he always loved to act. And when a roommate of his sort of dared him to try out for a play, he tried out and got a part. And that led really pretty much overnight to becoming male newcomer of the year of the British Theatre. But the passion for art never left. And it was something that, because he was making some money as an actor and getting to know amazing people, he could learn more and more about art. For example, when he was young, Edward G. Robinson, another Hollywood icon, great heavy, talk about bad guys, was one of the greatest art collectors out there. And he took my dad under his wing. Same with Fanny Bryce, huge art collector. She took my dad under her wing. And so he was able to have this sort of dual threat, of being somebody who was known to be an art expert, but also obviously was becoming more and more famous as an actor.
That is incredible. And he grew the love for acting, but the passion for art, preservation, and education of art never waned, never left.
Never left. He really felt that art should not be the province of the elite. It should not be something that you could only see in museums or only be in a rich person's home. He felt that everybody should invest in the process of learning about art, that the idea that certain people knew about art and certain people didn't, was ridiculous. And so throughout his life, he started a gallery in Los Angeles. He started the first Museum of Modern Art in Los Angeles. He then was on the board of the first LA County Art Museum and, all kinds of other boards, and eventually started his own museum in Los Angeles by donating. He and my mom donated part of their collection. But he also was on a show called the $64,000 Challenge, where he was an art expert, and then bought and sold art for Sears Roebuck in the 60s, and also wrote a syndicated art column, and eventually a number of books about art. So it was absolutely a passion for him. And at the end of his life, for the last 30 years of his life, he lectured 60 cities in 65 days every January and February for 30 years, mostly on the visual arts, but on the arts in general, being an advocate for the arts and encouraging young people to pursue their passions.
And if I may take a moment here, there's a book called I Like What I Know, written by your father. And this is a visual autobiography, it's called. And it explains quite a bit about his passion for the arts and his, not only his film life, but for most part, his advocacy and art collecting. So if anybody has a moment to pick this up, please go out of your way to do so. This is an outstanding read. And it's amazing from one author to another. It's in the family lineage. So
and my brother's a wonderful writer as well.
Excellent. Excellent.
He and my dad wrote 2 books together, one about monsters and one about American art.
I'm going to have to pick those up as well. There's nothing better than knowing that one of your favorite entertainers can be so multidimensional. I believe that he also had a bit of a culinary expertise. Could you elaborate on that? He also wrote a book on cooking.
He wrote a number of cookbooks. Yes, it started out, well, he had the whole family history because his father ran the candy company, but his father, so my dad's grandfather, invented baking powder and then went on to write numerous cookbooks and run one of the biggest cooking empires in the United States. When he died, the Chicago Tribune called him America's housewife's best friend. He was, so there was this cooking history from my great grandfather to my grandfather, but my dad really just liked to eat. And then he began collecting. He was a collector of experience, really. And he began collecting the recipes that he loved, like he would sort of con them out of a chef. And my mother would collect, who was a designer, would collect the design elements, and they would bring them back together, and they would entertain for their friends. And so when they were both working for Sears Roebuck, one of the executives at Sears thought, what a great idea to do a cookbook. And so my mother designed it, and they worked on it with a couple of the executives at Sears. And when it came out, it sold 360,000 copies. Saveur magazine called it one of the 100 most important culinary events of the 20th century. And it really put him on the map as a cooking expert. So they wrote, I think, 3 more cookbooks. And my dad had a short-lived cooking show in London, but just was constantly involved in supporting young chefs and the culinary industry. So, again, he understood, I think, before many Americans, because of course in Europe, people understood that the culinary arts are an art. But in America, we were all eating TV dinners in the 60s, and he was really an advocate for anything that was an art and encouraging young people to pursue it, which is, I think, aptly why they asked him to give the first makeup award. Obviously worn a lot of, prosthetics and amazing makeup and worked with some of the best, but also, he was somebody who understood that every part of the movie business was an art. Well, before the Academy did, obviously. They didn't get around to that till I think the early 90s. So.
That is true. To me, you brought up the fact that he partnered with Sears and Roebuck a few times, and I believe to go back to the art aspect, he made it accessible by selling these prints of this fine art. He made art education accessible to the masses by doing so.
Yep, you could go into Sears and buy, a Picasso for $90, a real Picasso for $90 on your Sears card with a money back guarantee.
He was ahead of the curve when I could imagine if your father came in a time machine to today, how he would just seamlessly fit right in, because it seems as though um, folks are now aware, thanks to efforts such as your father's, when it came to be so multidimensional. Your father wasn't just a horror icon, he was a pop culture icon. And that's going to segue us into Michael Jackson as well down the road. It's absolutely incredible to know just how many irons your father had in the fire, and he forged some amazing things out of all of them. And like, we could not do this interview without possibly touching upon his film career. Your father did not start in horror, correct?
No, less than a third of the movies he made were horror films.
Exactly. And now a lot of people probably ask you this question: was your father a horror fan?
You know, he was a fan of playing the villain. When he was young and he was cast first in Hollywood, he was gorgeous, and he was cast as these romantic leads, and he hated it. The actors he admired were like Eddie Robinson, his friend, Spencer Tracy, Jimmy Cagney, you know, character actors. But here's this 6'4", beautifully spoken, elegant, you know, aquiline face, you know, man, and he didn't know how to fit in. And so he did a play on Broadway in 1941, which was later made into the movie Gaslight. And he played this man who, you know, obviously is trying to get rid of his wife, one of the many wives my father tried to get rid of over the years. And he understood in doing that, that he could be a Gothic villain. So he was absolutely a fan of Gothic horror. And I think to that end, you know, what's interesting, you said he would fit right in. When you know, the horror genre turned much more bloody and we had chainsaws and blood spurting out and all of those things, he was less of a fan of that, because he felt that the human imagination is far scarier, will scare us way more than, you know, seeing somebody have blood spurt out of the side of their neck. It's the imagination that scares us. And he thought when movies didn't show that and you had to imagine it. And so now that we've really sort of drifted back into Gothic horror, and there's so much Gothic horror on TV, I often look at TV, not that I watch the shows because I don't like to be scared, but I read about them and I look at the premise and I think, oh, my dad would have been perfect. He would have just been cast nonstop in so much television now.
The theater of the mind. It is the scariest thing possible. And I do know that your father mastered that in his work. I want to build my way up to it, but I'm going to capitalize on it now. A lot of the Gothic horror he did was with Roger Corman.
Yes.
And what was the relationship with Roger and your father? He worked on so many films with him. It seemed like he was a very trusted ally of his.
I feel like both of them understood the gift of their partnership, their working partnership. And they really understood that they were both being given the opportunity. You know, here's Roger for my dad. What was great about Roger was that he was a young man who was kind of rising in the film industry, who was breaking norms, who was super creative, but had this deep respect for obviously film history, but literary history, art history. And here's my dad going into his 50s at a time when many of his peers were fading away, wanting to pair with younger people who had exciting ideas. But Roger understood my dad's sensibility and understood this gift that the partnership was for both of them. And he understood my dad's intelligence. And, you know, Roger's an incredibly intelligent man. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him now 3 or 4 times these last couple of years. And, you know, he is, I mean, all I have to do is say 3 words and off he goes, sharp as a tack, remembering everything, because God knows, I don't know anything about what happened then. So, you know, the gift that I understood from both of them, from what my dad told me and from what Roger tells me, is that, you know, often, but not often enough, maybe in life, you get the gift of the right person, the right material, the right time, the right place. And that's what that was. And who would have thunk that Edgar Allan Poe in the early 60s was going to capture the American imagination? But it did.
It did, and it's funny that you just said that. The perfect time, the perfect person, the perfect relationship. Um, on this podcast for the movie, we mentioned serendipities taking place, and that is what actually helped this come to fruition. As we tell our story about spooky haunted attractions, um, your father, it each decade was a chapter in his evolution of acting. And I love the latter years. I
Mhm.
love it was at the Monster Club. I love that film was is a guilty pleasure of mine. As your father went along, his work in the '70s, the Abominable Dr. Phoebes, all of those were just such a new chapter in his career. It did take the blood level up a little more in the horror genre, but at the same time, it was still psychological thriller. Um, but I just every time I see him on screen and I think of Edward Scissorhands, he's just immortalized there. He's very statuesque in that role, and I feel like that was one of the most perfect final roles that your father could have had. Like it was like handing off the reins off with Tim Burton and
Mm.
Johnny Depp at that point. But I can romanticize about your father all day, and I'm sure we both could. But when it came to horror, as he worked in the field, who were some of his favorite colleagues to work alongside with?
Well, obviously Boris, who was a dear friend, and they were very different in many ways in terms of their interests, let's say, but what they were both gentlemen who were grateful for their careers, took it seriously, were dedicated to having long lasting legacies. And so he loved Boris. I remember meeting Boris when I was a little girl, and you know how your take on certain adults when you're a kid is based on what your parents say about them. If you feel somebody is like, oh yeah, that person, you hear it, you know it. And I remember having this sense that I was meeting this gentle soul that both my parents just adored. I remember that very distinctly. And certainly, I mean, I met a million people, but that was very, very unique. But Boris, certainly, Peter Lorre, of course, because my dad was a film buff. He was a fan before he was an actor, and he knew who Lorre had been back in Germany and his whole career and his part in film history. And then, this genius improvisation. And my dad loved doing comedy, loved all of that. And Peter was just completely this improvisational, creative actor. So he loved that. But, that sense of longevity and old friendships, Joseph Cotton, who he was in Dr. Phibes with, or Basil Rathbone in all the Poe movies, those were people he'd known his entire life, his entire career. He and Joseph Cotton worked together in Orson Welles' Mercury Theater. He and Basil Rathbone were, with Boris Karloff in Tower of London, the one in the 1930s. So there was this sense of longevity. But I would say, my dad loved women. He just loved women. And so there were certain women that he just felt honored to be paired with. Obviously, Gene Tierney, with whom he made so many movies. But I think probably his biggest crush was Ava Gardner, that he got to work with. That he didn't get to work with probably Greta Garbo. He got to go to a dinner party with Greta Garbo and was over the moon about that. So he was a fan, which is, I think, why he was so great with his fans.
You mentioned overhearing things as a child. Did you ever have an opportunity to go to set with your father?
I did, yes. My parents were really great. They wanted me to not be a movie star brat. They wanted me to have a normal life. They wanted me to go to school. And insofar as somebody who grows up in a 9,000 square foot house and behind gates in Holmby Hills, California, could be called normal, they did a pretty good job. I wasn't allowed to watch TV very much. I read. I was not a spoiled brat, or I would still be grounded. Actually, I'd be locked in that dungeon in the movie if I had been a spoiled brat, but um but there were certain moments where I got to go on set, and it was always fun. But the one I remember the most was Theater of Blood. And we were living in London, and my dad was making Theater of Blood, and we had a driver. It was my dad's driver, but he was available to us if we wanted to do things. And he came to pick us up to go out to the set. And my mother was English, and the driver was Cockney, and I couldn't understand a word he was saying. So, but my mother, who, you know, was English and also had a great ear for everything, was chatting away with him. And I was just kind of looking out the window and noticing that it didn't look like the London that, you know, we were staying in, the nice London. It was kind of getting seedier and seedier. And all of a sudden we pulled up in front of this old warehouse, and we stopped, and the driver got out and went around and let me out on the sidewalk side. And then he went around and got back in the car, and I'm standing on the sidewalk. My mother isn't out of the car. The driver isn't out of the car, and in front of this just seedy thing. And I'm like, what's going on? And all of a sudden, all these like scary homeless people with like no teeth and scabs on their faces, they come running up to me, and they start pawing me and asking me for money. And I am 10, and I'm freaked out. And then my dad sweeps out of this warehouse, and he says, "You people, get away from her. That is my daughter. You can't treat her that way." And he puts his arm around me and walks me into the thing. And, you know, I was so relieved to have my dad, you know, back, that it was literally weeks. And not actually, I'm a little embarrassed to admit, until I saw the movie, that I realized it was all a stunt, and he had set it up just to play with me. You know, he was that kind of, he had that, all those sort of funny things. The first time I lost a tooth, and I was so worried that a tooth fairy would come, I lifted up my pillow the next morning looking for my nickel, and there was a disgusting corroded denture that he'd been saving for that moment. I mean, he had a wicked sense of humor, my dad. So, but that was the moment on the set that I remember the most.
I truly regret being born in the era I was born in, because I have a feeling that your father and I would have been the best of friends, just simply from our ribs. And I honestly want to say that after, you know, learning more about the man, learning more about the human being, when I become a father, I definitely am going to take some hints from his playbook, because it seems like he did an incredible job. I will say that. He also, like we were mentioning earlier, he transcended film into pop culture, because I remember the very first time I was introduced to your father, a certain number one album that has been on the pop charts for years and years and years, through generations, Thriller. Your father's haunting words in that literally chilled me to the bone as a 5-year-old, to the point where I had to skip past it. But your father's presence was so commanding in that. And to know that somebody at that time who Michael Jackson was more popular than any president, prime minister, religious figure, anyone in the world at that point. To know that he said, Vincent Price is my inspiration, and one of the reasons why I want to do this genre of a video and a song. Could you elaborate a little bit on his relationship in that album, how he worked with Michael, things of that nature?
Well, it came about for another pop culture reason. My dad in the 60s did all the TV shows that every kid watched. And part of the reason he did them was because I came along really late. My dad was in his 50s when I was born, and he wanted my friends and me to know who he was. You know, he didn't want to be some old guy, and he loved kids, and he loved being hooked into, you know, the younger generation. And one of the shows he did that, of course, I watched was Mod Squad. And his episode was really mainly with Peggy Lipton, and they just bonded. As I said, my dad loved working with women, loved working with actresses, and they just completely bonded. And she was married to Quincy Jones. So when Michael Jackson got this idea, because he'd met my dad a couple times, I think they'd been on talk shows together, and he'd been a little scared by my dad because he'd watched the movies, you know, and come to sort of recognize now, I think, you know, Michael Jackson's childhood was pretty horrific in some ways, at least according to what I've read. You never know. And I found that a lot of people who had very challenging childhoods were drawn to the horror genre, but also drawn to my dad, because my dad played the scary person, but you weren't scared by him. You wanted Vincent Price to scare the heck out of you, but you knew there was someone safe underneath. And so many people have come to me who are horror fans and said, I thought of your dad as my dad, my uncle, my grandpa, that sort of family figure, because my own family, I didn't have that. And so I'm sure maybe there was a little of that in there. I mean, for Michael Jackson. So he wanted to do this thing, and Quincy Jones just picked up the phone and asked my dad to do it. And my dad, one of the great things about my dad was he said yes. He said yes to things that other people probably would have been too grand to say yes to. For example, right now, everybody's talking about the Muppets this, the Muppets that, but that first season that the Muppets crossed over into prime time, they asked everybody to be on the show, and people were like, puppets in prime time? And my dad was like, sure. Just this morning, I was looking at, it was a interview by the Canadian Broadcasting Company in 1963. And the interviewer was this kind of nebbishy guy. And he said, oh, do you mind playing a werewolf and a vampire? Neither of which my dad ever played, And my dad was sitting there with his hand over his mouth. And he said, he took his hand off his mouth and he had fangs on. And he said, and they'd had a normal conversation before. And he said, why not? My teeth are as long as anyone else's. He was always willing to just jump in and play along because he had the confidence in himself to know who he was. So he was having fun with it. And there's so many people who wouldn't have done that. So he popped right in, and they filmed it. I believe it was in one take, essentially. And that was that. And nobody had any idea it was going to become the biggest selling album of all time, of course.
I believe it's still in the Billboard charts.
Wow.
If memory serves me correct, it still is.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's actually I feel like you're seeing my notes here, because I wanted to bring up his Muppets appearance. That was another one that I remember growing up.
Right.
He transcended generations. You could watch Vincent Price sitting with your grandparents. I was raised by my grandparents when my mom worked, so I was introduced to a love for black and white films at a young age, and I wasn't necessarily a horror fan. My horror love came after I went to Spooky World, which is kind of this butterfly effect that occurs here, because I believe we were talking before we hit record about how David Bertolino, who used to own Spooky World, saw a flyer or got an ad back in the early 90s of a haunted hayride out of New Jersey, out of Egg Harbor, New Jersey. And your father's likeness was on that ad. And it goes to show the gravity that your father's presence had. His image, his likeness will attention grab someone, and immediately they'll want to see what it has to offer. And that drew David Bertolino to New Jersey for the hayride, which spawned the idea for Spooky World, which now we're making a film about, and you're on our podcast. So look at how this all comes full circle. It's amazing. But I want to get a little further into the wisdom that your father had, the human being he was. We are filming this in June, and June just so happens to be Pride Month, a very important month of the year. And I'd like to take an opportunity for those who don't know to have you, Victoria, tell a little story about you and your father when you had to have an important conversation with him at the time, if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us.
Sure, absolutely. So I was, I'm going to say maybe 24 or so. And at the time I was dating a woman, and I told my mother that, and we had a horrible fight, and we didn't speak for another 2.5 years. And the one thing she said was, never, ever tell your father. It would kill him. And, you believe those things. You believe these things that your parents tell you, especially at times of trauma. You take it in differently. And so I was visiting my dad, at this point, maybe I was, as I said, 24, 25. And we went out to lunch together. And I told my dad that I was seeing this woman. And we were driving down the hill from his house. And I remember he reached over and he held my hand and he said, um, I completely understand. I've always understood about the deep connection between men and women and women. And he said, and none of the women I've been married to have ever understood that. And I completely support you. And it wasn't long after that that he was invited to become an honorary board member of PFLAG, which is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And and it was just really beautiful. And at the end of his life, about 5 of the 7 people who cared for him were all gay men. He had these sort of group of angels around him who cared for him, and that was really, really important to him. But the interesting thing, being Pride Month, is that, you know, for years when I wrote the biography, everybody said, I know for a fact that Vincent Price is gay. And I would say, okay, how do you know? And these are the kinds of things people would say. I was at an art museum and he flirted with me from across the room. And I was like, and nothing. Or I was in a gay bar and he bought me a drink and nothing. And so I talked to Roddy McDowell about it. And I said, what do I do about this? Because I don't want people to feel like I'm sort of skirting the issue. But on the other hand, you know, and Roddy said something very interesting. We don't know how your father felt about sex. And if we don't know that, how can we say? Long story short, many, many years later, and I purposely used the term I was dating women because at the time I was dating women. And in those days, in the 80s, when all our friends were dropping dead from AIDS, you felt like you had to identify as part of what was then pretty much you were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or straight, you know. But I never felt comfortable identifying as a lesbian because I never felt like one. And it wasn't really until this generation now that has understood that gender is much more fluid than we think it is, sexuality is much more fluid than we think it is, all of those things are much more fluid, that I really understood that I exist in that rainbow, but there's probably not a color or an initial for me, but I'm definitely in that rainbow. And finally, because I don't have to, you know, my sexuality was the least interesting part of me. And so to call myself something based on my sexuality felt wrong. But the reason I'm sharing that is because I know my father felt the same way. You know, when I finally found out, again, I wasn't in the room, nor was the person alive, but there was a transcript that there was somebody, you know, who claimed to have, and he seemed, you know, reasonable, have had sex with my father. What came out of that, a man, what came out of that was that they formed this great friendship. And when I asked the person who was working on this project about it, he said that was this artist's, he was an artist, that was this artist's MO. He would often sleep with someone and that opened the door to this deep friendship. And I was like, oh yeah, been there, done that. And I realized, you know, it's very true that I think sexuality for my dad was far less important than human connection of all kinds with anyone. And it certainly has been for me. And so to be able to sort of identify as an initial yet to be named on a flag of many colors is something I finally feel very comfortable about, even though I don't date anyone and I'm very happy. I'm very happy and probably will never date anyone again. That said, you know, of course. But, and I think that's how my father felt. And so one of the reasons he was so happy with my stepmother was she had been with a woman for 6 years and her first husband had been gay until they were together, but then it was a consummated marriage. So she too existed in this sort of nebulous place that only now the world is coming to understand that there is this fluidity, that if we could all embrace it around gender, around sexuality, around all the expressions of human connection and love, we'd probably realize that we're all a lot more similar than we think we are. And I think that's one of the reasons so many people are drawn to my dad.
He was ahead of his time.
He was.
I really think that he would be a very vocal advocate right now if he was still with us.
Oh,
I
yes.
would love to see hear what his thoughts are if he was with us today. But you know, we can go back a little further because I think that there is a thing that society now has lost is learning from mistakes, learning and growth. And your father wasn't always as progressive as we think that he is, and we know he is now. But I think that there's a valuable lesson to be learned in, you know, changing your ideology of things, and that's growth in its truest form. Your father back in the day leaned more conservative, Midwest. Those are the beliefs that they grew up in. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and how his growth over life changed?
Absolutely. And, you know, it's not even changing an ideology. It's just simply being able to change our minds, you know, and speaking, if there are any people who grew up in, you know, conservative Christian households, you hear the word repent all the time. Well, the word repent means rethink. You know, that's all we're being asked to do, is to rethink these ideas that we thought were so important. So my dad grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was an upper middle class kid. And like many white male upper middle class kids, he grew up with a certain set of beliefs. And so in his early life, he really was rather conservative. In the sense that, you know, I think the first president he voted for was conservative. He was anti-Semitic in some of the things he said and thought. And then he woke up. And when he woke up, he really realized the error of his ways. And he understood that he had just sort of imbibed what had been told him. And so what he was willing to do was change his mind. Now, the interesting thing is, that went on his whole life. In the 1950s, he was gray-listed during the McCarthy era. And when he was gray-listed during the McCarthy era, he got out of that by reaching out to what he called some nice Republican ladies who helped him clear his name. But in order to clear his name, he said some things that I know he didn't believe to clear his name. And that stayed with him as this fear. When I was in my 20s and getting invited to protests and, you know, and being hauled out of protests about the things that I believed in, he said, don't ever get on a list that can, you know, mess you up for life. So, but still, the more, you know, he was around my friends, he still was growing. And so it's about being willing to change our minds. And I think that I shared, it was interesting when I wrote the book a million years ago. Of course, the press was like, Vincent Price was anti-Semitic. And I was like, no, Vincent Price was actually awarded Humanitarian of the Year in 1960 something by the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, who introduced him as Vincent Price, the Great Jew. I mean, that was literally the, you know, the introduction. Nobody thought of my dad as anti-Semitic or racist. And yet, as we're all learning right now, many of the things that were just built in, things that my dad said in jest, were definitely racist. And he was the least racist person on the planet, but he was culturally of his time. So I shared it. The press was like, oh, he was anti-Semitic. I said, no, I'm not sharing this because my dad was anti-Semitic. I'm sharing it because all through our lives, we have to look at what we've been taught and be willing to change our minds and realize, like, we did the best we could with the knowledge we had and the information we had, but if it's no longer good, then we got to be willing to throw it out. And that's what he taught me. And that's where, if we're not learning that right now, then I don't think we've learned anything from the last couple of years. So
absolutely. Victoria, I really am happy that this pandemic is subsiding. I have my vaccinations and I look forward to hopefully seeing you back out on the road again, because I would like to sit down, have a cup of coffee, and discuss life in general further. I know that we are up against the clock here, but I do want to ask a few final questions. You impress me the more that I read your blog on Medium, which, if folks have not had an opportunity to check it out, is it the same name as your podcast? Is that
yeah, hide and seek.
Hide and Seek? Yeah, Hide and Seek. Please take an opportunity to view that. I read a wonderful piece last week on what was your father's 110th birthday, and the more I read what you write, the more endeared I am to you as a person, Victoria. You are incredible. And I think you're a voice that's very much needed in these times as well. I think you have the patience and the wisdom to convey some very important life lessons to folks. And I think folks should take that time to go to that and to view it. Also, I have a couple of books here. I mean, we are speaking of your father, so folks should take a moment to pick up the biography, A Daughter's Biography of Vincent Price by Victoria Price. Outstanding reading. But the one that really caught my eye was how poignant The Way of Being Lost is. Could you briefly tell folks what exactly the premise of this book is? Because it's incredibly powerful and life-changing.
Thank you. Sure. You grew up in a 9,000 square foot house with, aspirational people who are famous and successful. And you think that's the way you're supposed to move through the world. And yet I was miserable. I was a workaholic. I was just not happy. And right before my dad's 100th birthday, I decided to change my life and went out on the road and sort of connected with my dad's fans around joy. And I realized joy was the conduit to changing my life. But joy came in and, kicked me in the butt really as much as changed my life. And I began realizing that a lot of the things that I thought I was supposed to be, I was going to have to jettison. And so at some point, I actually, through a series you can read about it in the book of odd circumstances, became a nomad. And I was a nomad really up until literally the pandemic stopped me. I happened to be staying in an Airbnb, and I stopped because we couldn't go anywhere. And I had good work to do for clients, so I stayed there. And the place where I am now is an Airbnb. I still own nothing except my dog, but really she owns me if we're real. And it's incredibly freeing to own nothing and to feel like you're making a choice to walk away from all the things everybody says we're supposed to do. And when the pandemic began, I really prayed that was what we were all going to realize, that it was time for us to reconsider things. And I think we all did, but I'm not sure we did enough. I'm not done with my house cleaning, my mental and emotional house cleaning. But the book is about, being willing to get lost to all the things that we're told we're supposed to be in order to actually find who we really always have been.
That is incredible. I could not recommend this book any more highly, especially today. There are all these constructs as to how we are supposed to live our lives and how we are supposed to act. And I don't think we truly will know that until we know who we are at our core on an individual journey. And I think that this book is must-read material. As we close here, you do know that we are putting a little film together. And I think that the folks viewing this have been asking us a lot, how is this creativity going to be put together? And excuse me, I had an opportunity to view parts of this film, and we sent you a clip or a brief segment of this film and how your father is incorporated into it. I want to know first what your thoughts on what you're seeing from us are, and what you think your father's thoughts on this would be.
Well, in the clip, my father is in House of Wax, and he's talking about, I'm going to give the people what they want, shock and horror. And of course, that character understood that, but my dad understood that. Just as he understood it was more fun to play the bad guy because the bad guy has all the layers, he also understood that the world is drawn to the shock and the horror. And I think where he sort of felt that he held like the center was that he could hold the evil and hold the good, and you could examine that through his characters. In terms of the whole ethos of Spooky World, my dad loved amusement parks, loved them. And he loved attractions. He loved all of those things. The favorite parts of my childhood were going to these attractions. And my brother, who's 22 years older than I am, he was scared. He couldn't go on the roller coasters. Not me. We'd be in the fun houses together. The harder, the faster, the bigger the roller coaster on. So the idea of this place that was based on horror and scaring people to death, he would have loved it, because he would have loved the idea of playing with people's imaginations and engaging them one-on-one and scaring them to death. I remember I was maybe about 12 or 13, and he took me to see, it was when all those disaster movies were huge, and he took me to see Earthquake, and we lived in Los Angeles. And I couldn't sleep that night because my room was right next to this hill where I could hear the sand coming down the hill. Now, I probably had done that all along, but every time I heard like 3 grains of sand go down, I woke up and I'm like, we're going to have the big one. I'm going to be buried by this tiny little hill, you know? And I came down the next morning, my dad's making breakfast, and he said, how'd you sleep? And I said, terrible. I was so terrified after that movie. And he said, terrified by a movie? That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. And I remember even at 12 going, don't you make your living that way? So for him, the idea of a place that took every horror trope and actually put people into the middle of that and played with them enough to scare them so that they had the interactive experience, what he fundamentally believed was the world needs horror and fear in a controlled environment. Is the place where we can go in, face our fears, and come out and be able to face the much bigger fears. And places that sort of like Spooky World, or films that take something scary but blow it up to the point of, you know, in the back of your mind, you know, it's ridiculous. My dog Allie, I went through a haunted house in Salem, Massachusetts, because my friend, it was his house and place, and he made me do it. And I didn't want to leave Allie in the car because it was too noisy. I felt like they were going to call PETA at the end of it. My poor dog was shaking like a leaf at the end of this thing. And I was terrified, even though I knew it was all a game. But you come out of that and there's this sort of cleansing and catharsis. And I think that is why horror and Spooky World just took off. It's a place to connect with your icons, your idols, and the whole experience. It's like walking into a horror movie and getting to have that experience instead of just sitting there watching it. He would have loved it.
Now, did your father ever take you to a haunted attraction or a haunted house growing up?
Well, I was taken to see him in play Captain Hook in Peter Pan. I was about 4, sitting in the audience with my mother. And I freaked out so loudly and so audibly, much to the mortification of my very British, no public displays of anything mothers, that she had to take me backstage during intermission, which you never do. And my poor dad had to take the hook on and off. And, so I don't think they ever wanted to have to experience that again. So I never even saw his movies till I went out on my own. Because, the funny thing, sure, but they didn't want to have to deal with that child. And, you saw how badly Earthquake went when I was 12. So I was not that person. But the fun houses, absolutely. Sorry.
It's okay. My home is welcomes any barks that take place. I do know we're up against the clock. I do want to say that first, this is probably the greatest honor that I've had in this format.
Wow,
to speak with you because I feel that
and let me pick her up so we can finish this.
Sure thing. I want to bring her into it
all the way through it.
Could you please make some introductions to the audience as to who our friend is?
This is Allie, my companion, my brave companion of the road, to quote a Nancy Griffith song.
Hello, Allie, and welcome to Spooky 101. Do you have any thoughts?
She says she doesn't mind any of the scary stuff. She's met plague doctors. She's met all the scary people, and she thinks it's all fantastic.
Well, I do know that I will be bringing a little friend like Allie back into my home shortly.
Nice.
And I do want to say thank you so much for your time here today. It's an honor to be able to associate the Price family with Spooky World, and to know that this has come full circle. The inspiration of your father, his presence, helped bring this to life. And now we have our film coming to fruition. And on a more important level, on a human level, to be able to actually speak with you and to share the most valuable thoughts of humanity is truly what I'm going to take away from this. So thank you so much, Victoria, for your time today.
This was such a pleasure. It was such a wonderful conversation. And, I'm excited on my dad's behalf to be part of the Spooky World history as well. Thank you for everything we talked about. I loved it.
Good evening.